And so last week we were introduced to the Joseph narrative, and the Joseph narrative is going to be, I believe it's 14 chapters. It is the longest narrative in the book of Genesis. And so more was written about Joseph's life than Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or any other of the patriarchal figures, because Joseph is the link that gets the children of Israel to the Egyptian land, which is the audience with which Moses is writing this through inspiration to. This is their story. This is their story, how they got to Egypt. This is the story of the land that they have come from, that they're going to. And so we talked a little bit about last week about Joseph is the favorite son, right? And his father gives him a coat, and that coat is symbolized by what? Colors and long sleeves, right? Maybe colors more closely with long sleeves, right? And so it dignifies that Joseph is the favorite son. He's the one that is, not necessarily working with his hands as much as the other brothers. We're going to see that take place here in the second half of this chapter. And so Joseph is the favorite. And so he has dreams. In his dreams, he sees sheaves bowing down to his sheaf. He sees the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations bowing down to him. And what does he tell his family these dreams mean?
I can't believe he wasn't smart enough to know they were going to get mad at him and tell him.
Yeah, it's like, hey, brothers, you're going to bow down to me one day, right? Isn't that cool? Not as cool as you think it is, right? And so they have a little bit of an issue with that. And so now let's pick up and let's start reading at verse 12 of Genesis chapter 37. And let's see what takes place between Joseph and his brothers. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, already know. But let's go ahead and let's look what that says. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to them, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him to the valley of Hebron, from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now he gets to Shechem, right? Anybody remember what happened at Shechem a few chapters ago? There was the altar, right, that they put away their gods at Shechem, and they went to Bethel and they made an altar, made a sacrifice. What happened just before there at Shechem? You're right. Well, he wrestled with God, but something happened just a little bit before. He wrestled with God after Shechem on the way to Bethel. Remember Simeon and Levi? Is that what you said, Miss Susan?
No, I didn't say that.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Remember Simeon and Levi? They're at Shechem, remember? And their sisters violated. And so Simeon and Levi tell all the men they need to be circumcised. And they go in with a sword and kill them all, right? And so they're pasturing the flock up around Shechem. Joseph goes to Shechem to see them. It's about 50 miles away. And so here you can see he leaves Hebron. He goes past Bethel, which is where Jacob made that covenant with God. He goes past Bethel. He goes up to Shechem. But he gets to Shechem and his brothers aren't there. And so if you keep on reading the text, we don't have time to read the whole text. But he gets to Shechem. He can't find his brothers. And he meets a stranger who's roaming the land. And the stranger says, "Oh, you're looking for your brothers? They went to Dothan," which is about 15 miles north of Shechem. Dothan would have been one of the larger cities in that area. This was on the King's Highway, as it is often called, and this is kind of like the ancient international highway or, interstate system, right? And so this was a major port of trade, and so they're up there around Dothan, which is a large city at this time, and his brothers are there. And so he goes, this is a distance of about 65 miles. The average person covered about 20 miles in the ancient world, and so this would have taken Joseph at least 3 days to get there. Now the question is, this is a long trip over hostile territory. You remember a few years earlier, Jacob is actually afraid to travel from Shechem to Bethel with his family because he feels like he's vulnerable. And yet here he is years later sending his 17-year-old son on this 5-day trek, 3 to 5 days, over 65 miles, evidently by himself. Right? So it's kind of odd when you think about it, especially that they've got a large family with lots of men and slaves. And so just interesting tidbit. And so he goes to Shechem, about 65 miles north, and his brothers see him coming from far off. And why would it be easy to spot him? His coat, right? Maybe they recognize the camel. Maybe it was the coat of many colors, right? So evidently they see him coming from afar, and they say, "We should do something about this." And so what do they propose they should do to their brother?
They wanted to kill him.
Yeah, they decided we're going to kill him, right? And so there's a brother who speaks up and says, "Oh, let's not kill him." Right? Which one is that? Reuben. Now, have we been introduced to Reuben earlier? We've been introduced to all the sons, of course, but anything special about Reuben? Maybe in chapter 35, around verse 22.
Is he the oldest son?
Reuben is the oldest son, and just like Todd just said, he slept with his dad's concubine, right? And so, big no-no. So maybe this is Reuben's, the wheels are spinning, he's the firstborn son, right? So maybe he's thinking, this is the way that I can get back on the good graces of my dad. I'm going to save the favorite. We all know he's the favorite. I'm going to speak up, try to save him. And so Reuben says, let's not save him. Let's put him in this pit. Now, here in this part of the world, the rains are seasonal. We all have wet and dry seasons, right? It rains more this time of year than it does, normally in July or August. And so everywhere has, wet and dry seasons. During the dry season, these pits, which are dug in limestone or they're dug in the ground and plastered, they hold water for weeks, months. But as it becomes dry throughout the year, it's not uncommon for these, for several months out of the year, to be dry. And so it's not necessarily like a well, like you would dig a well trying to have, groundwater or find some sort of stream underground, but just a retainer, if you will. And so this retainer is empty. They put their brother in there, and then there's another brother who speaks up, and he's got a better idea instead of killing him. Which brother is that? Judah, right? And what does Judah say? Yeah, let's sell him, right? Why do we need to kill him and his blood be on our conscience? Why don't we just sell him, make some money? And so they look up and they see some Midianites and some Ishmaelites who are coming down. Interestingly enough, Judah plays a pretty important role in the Joseph story narrative. He has 3 speeches, if you will. Now, some you would think are kind of short to be a speech, but he talks 3 times. One of the interesting things about Judah's speeches, they get longer the 3 times they happen. They happen here, they happen in chapter 43, verses 3 through 10, and they happen in chapter 44, verses 16 through 34. And as time goes by, his speeches get longer, and they also get more commendable, right? He goes from being someone who wants to sell his brother for money to someone who's at least a little bit respectable, right, as time goes on. You kind of see the maturity of Judah take place, which is interesting. Why? Because Christ comes from the tribe of Judah, right? So this is his ancestor, if you will. And so Reuben and Judah, in their own way, they save Joseph from being killed. And so they see the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. And who are these from? Right? Ishmael's from the Ishmaelites from Ishmael, right? And Ishmael's dad is Abraham, right? The Midianites are from... They're from where? They're not from Esau. Close. They're from the sons of Keturah, right? And so Abraham's other wife, where she has 6 sons, remember? And so those sons are Midianites. If you go back, there's 3 generations that go back to Abraham. And so think about this. When they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, these are their second and third cousins. Think about this. I thought about this afternoon. It's kind of weird. Jacob Daugherty, Sam Wilson, and Riley McLaren. And there's others, but those are just the first 2 that popped in my mind. Right? Okay. They're all the same length to Mr. Daugherty, right? Ed and Ricky and their dad. They're the same length as Joseph and Reuben and Jacob. I'm sorry, Reuben and Joseph and Levi and Simeon to Abraham and these Ishmaelites. So, when you think about that, that's not that long of a time, right? And then people were living longer back then too. And so that's the same distance between Joseph and Abraham and these Ishmaelites and these Midianites. And so you can kind of see how maybe they were complete strangers, maybe they weren't. Who knows? But that's how close it was. And so...
And all the families had as many kids as the Daughertys did.
Looks like it. Yeah. We got 12, right? So Daugherty Smith, And so here they sell their brother to the Ishmaelites and Midianites. The word's used interchangeably here in Genesis 37, which is not uncommon. They live in the same place. They're all from Abraham. They kind of do the same thing, right? As far as trade, they're merchants. And so he sold to them for 20 shekels of silver. Now we've talked about this a few times throughout our Genesis class. How much does a shepherd get paid per year? I know, we've talked about it a few times, but it's been like over the course of several weeks, and so it's kind of hard.
Repeat it, please.
Anybody know first?
I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. How much was the pay for a shepherd for a year?
3 shekels.
Not 3. Not 30. 10. Right? It was 10 shekels. So they sell it for 20 shekels, 2 years' wage, right? They split that between 10 brothers. There's 12 sons. You don't split it with Joseph. You send him to slavery. Benjamin's not there. He's too young. And so you split it between your 10 brothers. 2 years' salary. I mean, if we just want to go with like the national average in America, $35,000 a year, times 2, 70, divided by 10, $7,000 apiece, right? Not a bad day's work for selling your sibling to slavery, right? We've all had that desire, haven't we? Took less than $7,000 at one point in my life. I'm just playing. But when you think about how wealthy this family is, I mean, $7,000 to them in the ancient is nothing, right? I mean, it's chump change. And so they just really don't like their brother, and they're just trying to get rid of him. And so, yes, Cecil.
Can we talk about their logic here? They were worried about it being on their conscience, the blood versus being sold into slavery. If they're still going to have to live with it, either way.
Yeah, it's true. Well, I guess you can always feel better about yourself for some reason. You know what I'm saying? Like when you play the percentages, I guess you would say, or when you say it's like, yeah, I sold my brother into slavery, but I was going to kill him. You know, I mean, cut me some slack here, right? Yeah. Well, and to bring out a great point that Steve brings up is that they looked at slavery much differently in their culture than we do, right? Slavery was much more common then than it is now. And, I mean, most cultures in the ancient world were slave-based cultures. I mean, even our own country, 200 years ago was a slave-based society and economy, especially in the South. Different a little bit, between ethnic slavery and slavery of class here in the ancient world, which was so prevalent all over the known world at that time. But they look at slavery a little bit different than we would look at it. They don't look at it as taboo as we would.
They didn't care that they were even going to go lie about it.
Yeah, they were just kind of like, the sons of Jacob don't look very good right here, do they? No. Not a very positive picture has been painted. And yes?
They actually probably split it down like 10 because Reuben didn't even know who was sold. Reuben went back and said,
yeah.
He knew where I left him.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting. I wonder if Reuben took the money or not. I don't know. That's a good question. When he got back, was he like, because he kept it secret.
He's the one who came up with the idea.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's a good question whether Reuben kept it or not. And so we'll never know. Well, I mean, we might know one day, but yeah, he was going to get him back out. That's right. And so he sits there. Reuben comes up with the idea. He tears his clothes first. They take his coat of many colors, potentially, his coat of long sleeves. They put some animal blood on there. They give it back to Jacob and say, "Is this Joseph's coat?" And of course, they know it's Joseph's coat. And his father sees it. His beloved wife has been killed in childbirth. Now his favorite son has been killed by a wild animal. And so, interestingly, the deception that Jacob does on his father, what does he wear? He wears Esau's cloak, right? The sons deceive him by messing with Joseph's cloak. And so you see the deception that's there in that cloak, that kind of, comes around, goes around type thing, if you will. And so he's sold to slavery. Jacob mourns. Interesting tidbit. He says, I'll go to Sheol. This is the first time that Sheol was used in the Bible. And so interesting. Sheol is the Hebrew idea of the afterlife. And so this is the first time that word is used here in this passage, which is kind of interesting. And so this is providential, of course. God had told Abraham earlier in Genesis 15:30 that his people were going to be slaves in Egypt in a foreign land for 400 years. How does this come about? This happens, right? I mean, they're wanting to kill Joseph. They look up, all of a sudden, here's some Ishmaelites and Midianites who are going to Egypt, right? And so this is all kind of providential, of course. Any questions on chapter 37?
You find it interesting, they never told Joseph that other people. They let Jacob give the narrative on what happened to Joseph. They never said a word. They just presented the code.
Yeah.
Jacob put it on Jesus. And everybody, that sounds good.
Yeah. And so you're right. I mean, they just kind of give it to him, and just he thinks he's been killed. They don't offer any commentary. They don't try to say, "Oh no, Dad, maybe he's not dead. Maybe he's hurt, and we should go look for him." It's like, yeah, you're probably right. That's we should move on with our lives. And so, good. All right, let's do chapter 38. And so we got 38 and 39 that I really want to get through tonight. We got 20 minutes, so buckle up. All right, it's going to get crazy, literally. And so here's the trek that made from Dothan to probably Hierapolis, where the Pharaoh was at that time. And so here you can see this long trip that makes while Joseph is in captivity. Then we get to chapter 38. Now, chapter 38 is very interesting. We won't have time to read this entire chapter, and so I hope you read ahead. There's benefits in reading ahead. And so you have Judah, right? And here we're told in the first few verses, let's read those together. And it happened at the time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son. He called his name She conceived another son that she bore, and he called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. And Judah was in Chizib, when she bore these. And so he goes away from his father's camp. He goes away from his brothers. He goes into Canaanite territory. There he meets and marries a Canaanite woman. We're also told that Simeon marries a Canaanite in chapter 46, verse 10. So is the firstborn. We're not going to keep on reading, but if you keep on reading, marries a woman of that area, and her name is Tamar. And so because is so wicked, God kills him because of his wickedness. God strikes him down dead. This is the first time in the Bible where someone is struck down dead because they're wicked. And so there's a problem now because Tamar is a widow and she has no husband and she has no sons, which in the ancient world leaves her extremely vulnerable. There's something called levirate marriage laws, right? Levar from the Latin, meaning husband's brother. And so in the ancient world, according to Hittite laws, the Hittite people were very close to here. This is also in the Code of Hammurabi. Whenever a woman's husband died and she didn't have a son, what was supposed to take place? Marry one of his brothers. That's exactly right. We kind of talked about that a little bit with the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, and Ruth a couple of weeks ago in that sermon. Well, by law, according to the Hittite law, and this is even written about by Moses in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, about how they're supposed to marry their brother. Well, to marry their brother, at least their brother, to fulfill the levirate action of producing a male offspring for her to take the place of the deceased husband. And so Onan is the brother, and so he's supposed to fulfill that. Well, let's read what takes place when Onan is supposed to do that for her. So let's look at verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went in to his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar the daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah my son grows up," for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. And so Onan is not performing what he's supposed to be doing as the brother-in-law, as it says here. And so because of his wickedness, just like his brother God strikes him dead. And so for the first time in the Bible, we see somebody struck down dead because of their wickedness or their sins. And we get two within 5 verses. So it's like rapid succession. And so, Judah's not looking very good as a dad, especially raising his boys to be honorable and perform their duties. And so he dies for his sin because his sin involves greed and the birthright there. And so this was not, Onan's motivation was not sexual pleasure. He was not trying to prolong, if you will, the experience of sleeping with his sister-in-law, now kind of pseudo-wife, because he wanted to, whatever. You get what I'm trying to say, okay? And so he's involving greed and birthright. Because if Tamar has a son, okay, how much is Onan going to inherit for himself? We've talked a little bit about the birthright, how they divide things. Let this be a mental exercise, okay? There's 3 sons. One has died, okay? If Onan gives Tamar a son to replace his brother, when Judah dies, how much inheritance is Onan going to receive? 25%. That's right. There's 3 brothers, right? One has died, but he's going to give one to take the other's place, right? You divide it into how many brothers there are plus 1, right? 4 ways. The oldest brother gets 2, right? Even though Er's son is going to be younger than obviously his uncle's, he still gets his dad's inheritance. So Onan gets 25%, okay? If Onan does not father a child by Tamar, how much does he get? 2/3, 66%, right? Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because it's an extremely wealthy family, right? And so even if you divide Jacob's stuff, 10 ways or 11 ways or whatever, wherever we're at right now in the story, right? Still a lot of stuff, and now you get 66% of that cut. But here's where it gets really interesting. At this point in the story, who gets the birthright from Jacob? Because who was it? It was going to be Joseph. For all intents and purposes, Joseph is dead. Wink, wink. Right? It's going to be Reuben. I mean, he shamed himself by sleeping with his dad's concubine. He may be out. Who's the next 2 oldest? Simeon and Levi. Right? They embarrassed themselves and their father by killing the whole town of Shechem. Now who's next? Well, there's Benjamin, right? But as of right now, who's next in line, I guess you would say? If it's not Benjamin, it's Judah, right? And so when this is going on, your dad's set to inherit the larger portion of Jacob's property. And so that 66% is looking really good right now, right? And so Onan was motivated by greed more than anything else. And so they die. Judah gets scared. In the ancient Eastern cultures, a woman who was married to husbands and the husbands kept on dying. In our culture, we would call that a what? A black widow, right? In the ancient world, they call that a witch. Like literally, like they thought it was, witchcraft, or that God hated you, one or the other. Either way, it wasn't a good thing. And so Judah's got 1 son left. He doesn't know what the problem is, but he ain't rolling the dice. So he's like, oh, you know what? Sheila's kind of young. Why don't you just kind of wait it out at your dad's house for a little while, and when he gets older, I'll send him over, and we'll start over from square one. And as the story goes on, Judah doesn't send over Sheila. He has no inclination whatsoever of doing that. And Tamar kind of gets the hint. And so she realizes that she's going to have to take matters into her own hands. And so that's exactly what she does. And so let's see what Tamar decides to do about that. Okay. Let's read verse 12. And in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers with his friend Hira the Adulamite. And then when Tamar was told, your father-in-law was going up to Timnah to shear the sheep, she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, wrapped herself up, sat at the entrance of Enaim, which was on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. And when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. And he turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me lie with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may come to me?" And he answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you'll give me a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet, your cord, and your staff that is in your hand." And so he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. All right? And so she goes, she dresses herself as a cult prostitute. This is the time of what? What is going on right now? It says this was the time of the sheep shearing, right? Throughout the Bible and also ancient sources, we see this was kind of a party time, right? This was a time of celebration. This was the time you were bringing in the harvest, if you will. And so this was a time that was oftentimes characterized by riotous living, both with inebriation, but also with sexual activities, because Canaanite religion was sexually based. And so their form of worship was sexual activities. And so they would oftentimes go whenever it was time to bring in the harvest, whenever it was an agricultural harvest, whenever it was the lambing season, whenever it was the sheep shearing season. And in order to ensure that they were going to have a fertile and productive year, they would go to a temple or a cult priestess, which was oftentimes at the gates of cities, and they would have sexual acts with that cultic priestess in the name of religion in order to ensure a fertile and crop, if you will. And so she knows her father-in-law. I don't know how she knows he does this. This is part of his character, whatever you will. But she realizes this is her chance. She goes there. She dresses like a cult prostitute. She would have known what they look like because, like I said, this was the predominant region in the land of the Canaanites. This is why the Israelites had such a hard time overthrowing Canaanite religion, because they just honestly were so sexually enticed, they just couldn't get away from it. And so she does this. She tricks her father-in-law into laying with her. He gives her his signet, which would have had his own personal seal on there, his staff, and his cord. And then 3 months later, guess what? Surprise! You know, she's pregnant, right? And so they go and they tell Judah, they say, "Your daughter-in-law, who's supposed to be in mourning, is 3 months pregnant." And what does Judah say? Yeah, kill her. For those of you who have read ahead, which you're supposed to do, how does he say kill her? Burn her, right? And then she comes out and she says, "Oh, by the way, whoever belongs to this signet, cord, and rod, that's who the dad is." And so it's like Murray back in the 90s. "You are the father," right? And so Judah says, "You got me." No, he says, "You're right." He says, "You're more righteous than I am." And so the text tells us that he doesn't lay with her ever again. But she does bear twins, right? And so the interesting thing here is she's having twins. Evidently they can tell she's having twins. So the first one makes a breach, and the midwife wraps a scarlet cord around the arm of the one whose arm is coming out first. Why? Birthright, right? But in a twist of events, right, he brings his hand back in, and the other one comes out first. And so the younger brother supersedes the older brother, which is interesting because guess what? Joseph's not dead just yet. And so it looks like the older brothers are going to be victorious because, you see, we do a disservice to ourselves because we raise your hand if you know the Joseph story and how it ends. Okay, just about everybody here, right? The first-time readers, they didn't know, right? And so they think, Joseph's in Egyptian captivity. You hear this story about these two twins, about the younger brother prevailing, even though he didn't come out first, if you will, with the hand. And then you go to the next verse, and guess what? Joseph's in Egypt, right? And so you kind of see the play that's going on here. It's also interesting. Perez is going to be the one whom Jesus comes through. And so those are the two twins, Perez and Zerah. The younger brother prevails, and Christ comes from Judah through the line of Perez. And so any questions or comments on chapter 38?
She wouldn't have been able to marry again, would she? I mean, she just had to wait till
Yeah.
longer each brother.
Yeah, most likely not. The purpose, when she would have had a son, she would have been indispensable, because now that son was set to inherit his grandfather's stuff, and that was his right. And so he would have been protected by the family because that's his stuff, and by being his mom, she would have been protected too. And so she'd have been protected because she had a boy. Now, until she had a boy, she was still kind of property of her dad. Her dad had the burden, if you will, of taking care of her and providing for her. And so Judah thought he was going to get rid of this problem once and for all when he found out she was pregnant. Didn't realize, you haven't got rid of the problem. In fact, she's taken 2/3 of your stuff, really taking 3/4 of your stuff. Right? No, 2/3. Yeah, 2/3. Yeah, 2/3. And so, good question. Any other questions?
Interesting is who God uses to strike down the wicked.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be as bad as what Joseph's brothers do in the plot with.
Yeah. It's interesting. Of course, with Joseph's brothers, you get the 50-20 thing, right? You meant it for harm, but God meant it for good, and they still got to get down to Egypt and make a bunch of babies and make a nation. So it's kind of hard to strike them down dead. But like you were saying, it is interesting, because we've read about some wicked people so far, right? I mean, but it's interesting. These are the two. Now, we're not told what Er's sins are, how wicked and evil he was. Evidently, he's a pretty bad guy to be the first guy that God strikes down. But it's true. It's true. You had me nervous there for a moment, Steve. I was just about to say, that was less awkward than I thought it was going to be. And then you had your hand up and I was like, oh no. And so, okay. All right, moving on to chapter 39. And so this is, once again, because of time, we won't be able to read everything here, but a great story. In chapter 38, with Judah and Tamar, it interrupts the Joseph narrative. You got 14 chapters devoted to Joseph, and you got Judah and Tamar that stuck right after the very first chapter. Now, many critics would say, well, it's just a bad editing job. The Bible's not inspired. It was put together in the 700s by Israelites. They were conflating multiple histories. They did a bad job of editing this piece together. They couldn't find a place. They stuck it. They got caught sticking it in the Joseph narrative. Just shows the Bible's not inspired. I would say, nay, right? I think it's a beautiful illustration of God trying to drive home a comparison between the life of Judah and his outlook and Joseph. Because, Joseph is taken away from his father by force. Judah leaves of his own free will, right? Then we'll see some more parallels, or I guess you could say differences here in the next chapter. But in chapter 39, let's read the first few verses there. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, the officer of the Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Ishmaelites and had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Now this is the first of 4 times that it's going to say the Lord is with Joseph in this chapter. Verse 2, verse 3, verse 21, and verse 23. Over and over again, the reiteration that God is with Joseph and God has not forsaken Joseph even in a foreign land. This is a big deal because in the ancient world, gods were only as powerful as where their altars were. And so once you left that God's presence. That's probably why Jonah gets on a boat and tries to go to Tarshish. Because the ancient idea was you get far enough away from God's temple, he can't do anything to you because that's where his power is. This is saying that he's in Egypt, which is a far away, and God's just as powerful there as he was back in Canaan. God blesses him greatly. Now, the official in Pharaoh's court, Potiphar, we don't know what he was. Most people come down with 2 things. He was either a military official or he was a butcher. Because the literal translation was he was the captain of the slaughter. So does that mean that he was the captain of the slaughter, aka slaughtered the animals for the Pharaoh, or is he just like some hardcore like 1980s Russian general, like in a movie, the captain of slaughter? Who knows? But that's what he does. And so evidently he's a pretty high official because, as we're going to see later, the Pharaoh's prison is pretty much at his house, on his compound, if you will, unless he is over the cooking, and that's why you see the cupbearer and the baker in his own little personal prison. But God is with him greatly. He's there. Potiphar, just like Laban, he can see that everything that Joseph does, God blesses, just like Laban was able to tell with Jacob. Potiphar is a pretty common name in the ancient world. It was used for well over 1,500 years that we can tell from different relics and artifacts from Egypt. And so Potiphar's wife, she sees that Joseph, what does the Bible say about Joseph? Yeah, well built and handsome. He's got a pretty body and a pretty face, right? And so Potiphar's wife sees this. She lusts after him, and the text tells us that day by day, or every day, right, that she constantly tries to entice Joseph to lay with her. And yet he doesn't. What does he say? Great line. I can't sin against my master, your husband, or God, right? I can't do this. Which shows you the difference, right? You got Judah who's running off and having sex with a priestess of a foreign god, so he thinks, right? In a religious action. And here you have Joseph who is 18, 19, 20 years old, right? And he's having this woman trying to entice him every day. He says, I can't do this. And so one day she tries to entice him again. He says no. She grabs him. He flees. And she screams. And so the slaves come in and says, the Hebrew tried to attack me. I grabbed his garment. He got scared when I screamed, and he ran off. And so he was sold into slavery because of a garment, and now he's going to be put into the dungeon because of a garment, right? And so Potiphar gets there, and he's angry. Now the question is, who is Potiphar angry at? Is he angry at his wife, or is he angry at Joseph? Because if he's angry at Joseph, if I was Potiphar and I believed my wife, I would have probably done the normal thing in the ancient world, which would have been to kill Joseph, right? I mean, that's just something you don't do. But he doesn't do that. He gives him a place in the prison where the Pharaoh's prisoners are. And then he gets an elevated status, and we're told later on in the last verse of 39 and also in chapter 40 that it's on Potiphar's land. And so he gets this elevated status, this state, even on Potiphar's land. So it seems like maybe Potiphar realized that he could not let Joseph go or confront his wife, because that would have been a huge mark of shame on his family. But at the same time, he didn't want to punish Joseph for something that he probably did not do. And so it's just kind of interesting that we see there. As Christians, we should flee sexual morality, 1 Corinthians 6:18. And so here we see that the Lord was with him. So Joseph is put in prison. The Bible tells us that God gave him steadfast love and favor in the eyes of the prison ward. And so it's hard to see, if we were in Joseph's shoes, God's steadfast love and favor in this incident. But the Bible tells us that God was doing this for a purpose that Joseph would be able to look back and see why it happened. Genesis 50:20. And so, but as he is there, he's put in charge of everything. Now we know of the Brooklyn Papyrus that has a list of functions that took place in Egyptian prisons. One of those is the headmaster or the director, and his subordinate, the keeper of the prison. And so this dates back to within 100 years of Joseph. This text is 4,000 years old. And so it's one of the oldest examples of papyrus you'll ever find. So it's really cool. But it has the exact office designation as you see here in Genesis 39. So pretty cool from an archaeological standpoint. The takeaways, God's knowledge. He knew of and Oman's wickedness, and he struck them dead. But he also knew of Joseph's faithfulness, and he blessed him, and he was with him. The next thing is God's blessings. Even in the hard times of life, it may not seem like a blessing at the time, but God was keeping Joseph safe in prison until the time came for him to become the second most powerful man in the world. Joseph probably didn't know that in prison, but he was content to wait it out and see what was going to happen. That's the kind of faith he had even in his 20s in God. And so we should be looking for God's blessings even during the hardships and trials of life. And thirdly, the treatment of others. And so Tamar was a widow who was being mistreated. And so we're told that the pure religion before God is how we treat the vulnerable among us, the orphans, the elderly, but also the widows in James 1:27. And so just as God had an expectation for Onan to fulfill his duty towards his sister-in-law who was a widow, as Christians we still have a duty to those who are vulnerable, to those who are in need, that we still have to fulfill today. Good comment. Anything else? Anybody got a spare bedroom or anything? No? Okay. All right, well, thank you so much for your comments. Appreciate your patience. Went a few minutes over. But we got through 2.5 chapters. That's great. And I'm looking forward to see what's going to happen to Joseph as he's in prison next week. And so if you don't mind, let's go ahead and let's bow in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for the example of men like Joseph who were able to, even in difficult circumstances, even with the knowledge that their family were thousands of miles away, who were able to be faithful to you even during the midst of trials and hardships. Dear Heavenly Father, please give us that type of resiliency. Give us that type of faith that even in the hardships and trials of life, that our faith to you will be vibrant and strong. Please help us to follow you despite the actions of others, despite the enticements that the world may offer us, and whatever temptation that might be or whatever form that is. Please help us to have the attitude of Joseph and ask ourselves, how could we sin against you? And please be with us and watch over us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.